That's where we should be.
Right.
Well, Adobe Lightroom Classic version 11 is finally here. And with it comes a slew of improvements to the program. Some are major, some are minor. I'm going to quickly run through the minor improvements so that we can use the bulk of our time to talk about the new masking tools that really are the marquee feature of this release. I've been dying to tell you guys about this new masking system ever since I first got to try a pre-release version of it a couple of months ago. You guys are going to flip out when you see this stuff. And don't worry, all the old familiar tools that you've used for localized adjustments are still there. They just work a lot better now, and they've got some powerful new friends. The system requirements have been bumped up just a little bit for this latest release. Mac users, you will need to be on the operating system 10.15, Catalina or higher. Windows users, you need to be running a 64-bit version of Windows 10 that is version 1909 or higher. If you haven't already, you can upgrade to the latest version of Lightroom using the Creative Cloud desktop app. There's a little area where you can check for updates and you can install the new version. The first time that you launch Lightroom 11, you're going to get a dialog that pops up asking to upgrade your catalog. This makes people a little bit nervous when it first appears. They're worried something's going to happen to their existing catalog. Don't worry. Your old catalog gets preserved. It gets copied into the new catalog and the previews get harvested, but your old catalog is still there if you ever need it for any reason. The other thing they give you at the point at which your catalog gets updated is the option to rename that upgraded catalog. I usually do, I'll stick a version 10 or a version 11 on the side of it so that I know which version of Lightroom it's designed to go with. There's a new catalog sidecar file that's going to appear in the folder alongside the catalog file. You guys are used to that LR-cat file that's the catalog and the LR data file that has all the previews. Well, they've got a new one that's .lrcat-data. And that thing holds the smart selection masks that get created by the new masking tool. So it's integral that you keep this file with your catalog if you move it to a new location. And that file will also be automatically included in the built-in catalog backup. All of you who have newer Canon cameras like the R5, the R6, the 1DX Mark III, and the R3, good news. At long last, we finally have camera matching profiles. These had been conspicuously missing from Lightroom 10. These are those profiles that emulate the native picture styles for each of those cameras, the standard, neutral, portrait, landscape, vivid, mono. So you should be able to get better looking color right out of the gate. There's a preference we talked about in the Lightroom classes having to do with automatically writing changes to XMP. It's a little esoteric, and I recommended against using that because there was a big performance hit when you did. Well, it's now a viable choice because all of the changes get cached while you're working on the file, and they only get written out when you move to the next photo. So the performance hit is much lower now if you'd like to be able to enable this feature for some reason. They have improved the metadata panel, the place that shows you all the little information about your picture, name, rank, serial number, aperture, ISO, shutter speed, all that good stuff. What they've given you now is the ability to customize the default metadata display. So you get to pick which fields show up there, and you get to arrange the order that they appear in. So you can customize that little metadata panel now to show exactly the little bits of information that you personally want, rather than using one of the canned combinations. There's also a little option in the metadata panel now, if you're holding more than one picture, to apply any changes you make to either one picture, the one that's targeted, or to all of them that you're holding. And finally, they give you an option to show the editable or the non-editable fields in the metadata. The non-editable fields are going to be things like aperture and ISO and shutter speed. These aren't things that you're going to change. But the editable field, things like captions and titles and things like that, those are changeable. So they give you the ability to show or hide there. They did make a little bit of an improvement to that filter bar we use up at the top to search and sort and filter and find our photos. The one thing that they've added that I really like is this new month and day combination. So you can use a month and day filter to find annual events like Christmas or Thanksgiving or a birthday. So you can say, find me everything on 12/25, regardless of what year it was. Previously, you had to drill down through the year to a month to a day. Now you can grab up a month and day. So that's clever. You can grab up all your holiday pictures, for example. The other thing that they have added are some new premium presets, or at least they call them premium. You've got auto plus retro, a black and white, a new cinematic, a food, a landscape, a lifestyle. I think there's one for urban architecture. Although I use them less and less these days, presets are still a fun way to try out different looks on your images. And the last sort of minor change is they did a little tweak to the crop tool so that when you put the crop tool away, the image will always reset to the fit to screen view. So you always see the whole image. You're not zoomed in a little bit and unsure of where your crop left you. All right, enough with the selected shorts. Let's get to the main attraction. With the release of Lightroom version 11, Adobe has entirely overhauled and upgraded the masking tools. I think these new features are the most significant improvements in the history of the program, going all the way back to version 2. And I don't say that lightly. I've been with Lightroom since the very beginning, and this really is a huge leap forward for all of us who edit with it. These new tools add a degree of precision to the editing process that simply wasn't there before. Look, if we're being honest here, the existing localized adjustment tools in Lightroom were a bit on the crude and primitive side. They worked well enough, but they didn't have a lot of nuance to them if you really want to dig down into the details of your image or make more precise corrections. But this new masking system gives us a level of fine-grained control that we've never had in Lightroom before. What was once a rather blunt set of tools is now much sharper and more capable, and they'll only get better in the coming revisions and updates. These new tools are already changing the way I edit, no joke. And I'm not saying you don't still have a need for Photoshop. You absolutely do. But I will say that you have fewer and fewer reasons to go to it for most of your day-to-day normal photography tasks. I will include a couple of useful links in your notes. For those of you who haven't taken one of my classes, when the workshop's over, you guys are going to get mailed a set of notes and a link to the video and some other goodies that I have for you. So there's going to be a couple of links in your notes, and one of them goes to Adobe's official help page for the new masking tools, and the other one is to a blog post from Adobe's Camera Raw team, the people who develop these tools. And it's a great conversation about how these tools came to be and about how they work. Both are worth a read. So a quick refresher on what masks are and why we need them. The controls in Lightroom's Develop module let us adjust the color and tone and detail of an entire photo. And we call these global adjustments because, well, they affect the entire image. But sometimes you don't want to make adjustments to the entire photo. Sometimes you want to make corrections to a smaller, more limited area within a photo. That's often the process that takes your images from good to great. For example, you may want to lighten or add contrast or change the color of a subject to make it stand out from the background. You may wish to enhance the sky or the foreground in a landscape or alter any other feature within the frame. We call these more specific changes local or localized adjustments because they impact a smaller, more localized area instead of the entire image. So these local areas are defined within a picture by using the various masking tools that are available in Lightroom Classic. To date, these have been the adjustment brush, the linear gradient or graduated filter, and the radial gradient. When you create a mask in Lightroom with one of these tools, you're telling the program exactly where you want a specific adjustment applied. You can think of these masks the same way you would think about a selection in Photoshop. It's a fenced off area within the picture that you want to adjust. Anything outside that selection or mask won't be affected at all. And as with all the other adjustments applied in the Lightroom, in the Develop module and Lightroom Classic, the ones that you make using the masking tools are non-destructive and are not permanently applied to the photo. So Lightroom now contains 8 masking components that you can use either individually or in combination with each other to create masks. The first 2 are the new AI-based ones, artificial intelligence or machine learning, for masking subjects and for masking skies, and they are nothing short of miraculous. The next 3 after the AI-based ones are the ones you already know from previous versions of Lightroom, the brush and the 2 gradients. And the last 3 create masks that are based on ranges of color, luminance, that is to say brightness, and depth, if you have one of those iPhones that shoots a picture with a depth map to it. So let me talk a little bit about the select sky. That's going to have the little sky icon. In fact, let me pull up a graphic for you guys. Let's see if I can find where I am in my notes here. Okay, so first you've got the select subject mask. Hopefully you guys can see the little screenshot I've got up here. That's the one that has the little person icon with the dotted line around it. Adobe has ported their AI routines from Photoshop that they use for identifying and masking off subjects that are within the frame. This too is quite miraculous and will only get better over time. And then right below that is the select sky mask, which is a little sort of a landscape picture or a sky picture with a dotted line around it. And Adobe has brought their sky selection technology over from Photoshop, where we've had it for a couple of years. Select Sky creates a precise mask, even around trees and leaves and uneven edges around the sky, making creating complex selections incredibly fast. It is like magic. Below that, you have the 3 existing adjustment components, the ones that we've had previously, the brush, the linear gradient, and the radial gradient. There's a couple of new tweaks to those, and I'll show you when we get into the live demo. And then finally, we've got 3 more tools that have been given their own independent power. They used to be embedded within some of the other tools. We now have a color range tool. That's the one that has the little color wheel with the eyedropper. And that allows us to mask off a selected range of colors. We have a luminance range tool. That's the one with the sun and the little eyedropper. And that allows us to select different ranges of luminance or brightness within our picture. And then the very last of these new masking components is the depth range. That's got the little perspective grid and eyedropper icon. As of now, as I mentioned, that's limited to files that were captured on the iPhone. All right, back to the plan. Okay, so we've got these 8 masking tools that we can work with, all these little bits and pieces that let us mask off part of our image. So the individual masking components are powerful enough on their own, but when we combine them together, they offer us the kind of control and flexibility that we have never had before. We can now isolate and select elements within our photos that would have been laborious, if not impossible, to do with the older tool set. Here's a great example, and one that I use all the time now to get instant figure ground separation. By making one of these select subject masks, which is going to mask off the subject for me automatically, and then making a second select subject mask that you invert to get everything except the subject, you can quickly and easily get individual local adjustments for the foreground and the background in your photo without having to paint those in by hand with a brush. If all you learn tonight is how to make these 2 adjustment masks, one for the subject and one for everything else, then your time will have been well spent. This is a technique you will use frequently. So by combining these 8 masking components together in different ways, you can make all sorts of complex and sophisticated masks, allowing you to very precisely place the adjustments in your images. So once you've created an initial mask, maybe you selected a subject or a sky or a range of color, or you painted something in with the brush or the gradient, you can then add to it, subtract from it, or intersect it with any of the other masking components. This sounds somewhat simple at first, but these combinations and permutations allow you to refine your masks in some powerful and useful ways, which I'm eager to show you. I got to tell you, the more I use these tools, the more clever ways I am finding to combine them to get exactly the kind of mask that I want. It has completely changed the way I look at editing in Lightroom. So let's start with some simple examples and work our way up to the various combinations that you can create. Once we've covered the basics, I'll show you guys how to add, subtract, or intersect single and multiple masking components with each other to create complex and subtle masks that'll get just the area in the picture that you want to target. I have a whole slew of sample images chosen to demonstrate the possibilities of these new masking tools. Now, they may not be award-winning photos per se, but they are well suited to showing off what the tools are capable of. So as we work through the demos, I'll explain how the entire masking interface works.
Jeff, do you know you're no longer sharing screen?
I do. I'm just about to turn it on. What if you have more than one catalog? Will they all upgrade? You can upgrade them individually by opening them. How does the select subject mask handle hair? Brilliantly. It's as good as the one that's in Photoshop now. It is absolutely amazing. So let's get into the program, shall we? All right, let's just jump right in and I'll show you the magic. I'll show you the coolest thing about this thing. In fact, since someone asked about the hair, we'll start with this picture because it's got some good hair in it. So everything, all of the masking tools, all the ones that you used to find up in the toolbar up here, in the toolbar, where all the masking tools used to be, is this little circle with the dotted line around it. That will open up the masking panel. You still have the crop tool and the healing brush and the red eye removal, but instead of having the adjustment brush, the linear gradient, and the radial gradient, you have this little circular icon. And when you click on it, it pops open this pane below that has all of the different masking pieces. So I'm going to start with the magical one, which is select subject. And I'm literally just going to click on this. And when I do, you'll see it's detecting the subject down here. And it's gone and made for me an almost perfect mask of my subject, including the hair. In fact, let me turn this to a white on black mask so you can really see it. There you go. And it's not just black and white. If you look closely, you'll see there's some shades of gray in there as well. So it's able to make this incredibly sophisticated mask automatically. I literally clicked a button and I have a selection that only affects my subject. Fabulous. So you'll see that there's now this little mask panel that's popped up here. I've got all of my regular adjustments over here, and I have a thumbnail that shows me my mask. In fact, if I hover over it, it'll show the mask. I'll switch the view back to the traditional red color overlay that we're used to. You'll also notice that there's a little icon for the mask right here that's got a little person on it. So you can dock the window by double clicking it, and it'll dock over here in the top of your toolbar, or you can break it loose and it'll hang out on the side here. That's up to you. You can actually put it anywhere on the screen that you would like. So one of the most important distinctions that I need to make right from the start is the difference between a mask group and the masking components that are contained within it, because this can be a little confusing at first. So this first mask here, which I'm actually going to rename, all I have to do is double click on it. We'll call this Stuart because, well, that's who it is. And you'll see that that's the mask. That's the main group. But contained inside it are all of the components that added together make this mask. So the individual components, like the brush or the gradient or the subject selection, those can all be added and subtracted and intersected with each other, and they build together to make whatever the final mask is going to be. So this up top here is the finished mask, sort of what they all add up to. And this is one of the components that's part of that mask. Currently, we just have one, and it's a subject. And as I mentioned, you can rename your masks. This is incredibly handy for keeping track of what each mask does, and it's a way to stay organized when you have created a number of masks. So I'm now going to make another mask. I'm going to click Create New Mask. That'll make a second one, and I'm going to select the subject again. Except this time, after it's selected the subject like it did before, I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to click this Invert button. And that's going to flip the mask around. And now everything except the subject has been masked. So I literally got my foreground and my background separated by two automagic masks. We'll call this one background. And now I can take this background mask, which includes a subject selection, and I can make it active by clicking on it. And now let's say we want to bring down the highlights in the back, or maybe we even want to darken it down a little bit. I can switch to my foreground subject, Stuart. Maybe we want to brighten him up a little bit. I want to caution you, these masks are so clean that you can make your pictures look like they've been green screened. So if I push this too far and I bring him up too bright, or I make the background too dark, it's going to look like I've put together two separate pictures, even though they were in the original. But I want you to notice how beautifully it has masked even the fine hairs around the head there. So let's bring the exposure back up on the background. Once I've made that mask, all of the sliders are available to me. I can make it warmer in the background. I can make it more saturated if I'd like. I can turn up the dehaze a little bit if I want to clear out some of that haze, or I can turn it down if I want to add some fog. I can go back to my subject in the foreground, and maybe I don't want to bring him so bright. Maybe I'd like to warm him up a little bit with a little temperature slider. So all of the adjustments that you always had before, you still have now, but you have some more sophisticated ways of making these masks. So the select subject was the number one sort of cool new feature, followed very quickly by the ability to select the sky. So I'm going to click on this bridge photo. I'm going to click the select sky. If I don't have my masking tools out, I just click on this little dot to bring them out. I'm going to click select sky. It's going to take a minute, and it's going to find every little bit of sky in there. You can see that indicated by the red overlay. And it's done a beautiful job of blending that in at the edges of the trees. If we come over here and look at the edges, can you imagine trying to do this with the paintbrush or any of the other previous tools that we had? Well, now you have the ability for the program to just automatically select that sky for you. That is fabulous. And of course, because I can invert the sky, I can also make a selection of everything that isn't the sky. Give you another sky select example here. Select sky, wait for it to do its work. Boom, instant sky selection. Let's do another figure ground separation. So I love the lighting that I've got on my subject, but my background's way too bright for me. So I can take my subject, and I've already masked her using the select subject. I might bring down the highlights a little bit on her face, but I'm much more interested in getting that background and taking this background and dropping the exposure a little bit. So I've got a much nicer natural scene. Now that feels much more like I want the picture to look. And I did not have to go in there with a brush, a finicky little brush, and find things. So a couple of clever things I want to point out here. I can select the masks directly from the list here. And so when I select her, it activates that mask. When I select the background, it activates that mask. So you know what this means? No more hunting around for that damned gray dot. Thank you, Adobe. You have saved my sanity. Finding those little control points in the old version of Lightroom in a black and white image was like a cruel version of Where's Waldo. Not only can I select these all by their name right out of the list, and when I hover over them, they light up the masked area, but they also have these cute little icons that they put on the screen. There's a person selection icon. I'll bring up another picture here and I'll show you all the different icons this one has. This one has, see this big little down arrow thing here? This is for the entire mask that I've selected. When I click on it, I'll see that, this one is a sky mask. And this one over here is my subject. That has the little person on it, so I can see my subject. I have made a color range selection, which you can see down here is this little guy that looks like sort of a color wheel. And that represents all the greens that are in my picture. So I've just masked off the greens. And then I did a luminosity mask for the shadows. I just wanted to be able to adjust the shadows here. So you can see that I've made a mask based on a range of brightnesses here that are only going to hit the very darkest parts of my picture. So if I want to lift just those shadows, I can do it without affecting the tonality in the rest of the image, or maybe I'd like to make those even darker and more contrasty. So I just wanted to show you guys that we have all these clever little pins now that are a little bit easier to find visually on the screen. I still find it much easier to just go grab them off the list. So there's my subject, my sky, everything that's green in the picture, and everything that's in the shadows in the picture. And as I mentioned, you can hover over any of these masks to highlight. Let me quickly run through these different overlay options. You guys are already familiar with the red and green and white and black and gray overlays from the previous version of Lightroom. The letter O will toggle it on or off. Let's go ahead and grab the sky. That's the easiest to see. So if I hit the O key, that'll turn it on. If it's off, you can also hover over the pin to temporarily see it, or you can hover over the little thumbnail of the mask in our masking panel. So I'm going to hit O to turn that on. If I want to cycle through all the colors that are available in that traditional color overlay, I'm just going to hit Shift O, and we get the green and the white and the sort of black or gray, and then back around to the red. So the new wrinkle is that Option or Alt and O will cycle between the new overlay modes that they've given us in the masking tools. So in addition to the traditional colored overlay, which sort of looks like a red ruby lith here, you can preview your mask in a number of different ways. So we've got the color overlay. These are all going to be found in this little 3 dots menu right at the bottom of the masking pane, right next to where it says Show Overlay. I can check it there to turn it on. I can hit the O key. Here's the color that I have for that mask. And good news, people, you are not limited to red, green, white, or black anymore. You can pick any color, any hue or saturation, and you can pick the opacity. And I'll tell you who this is going to be handy for. I've got a number of photographers I work with, men typically, who have red-green color blindness, and some of them have it pretty bad. And by moving the mask color to something that's maybe in the blue or purple range, you might be able to see it much more easily than the masks that are red and green. You can change the overlay so that it shows the unaffected area instead of the affected area. I don't know why you would do that, so I'm not going to encourage that sort of thing. But there's a few new overlay modes that are really cool. So we've got our color overlay. Then we have color overlay on black and white, where it's going to black out everything else in the picture so I can see my masked area very clearly against black and white. I can switch it so it shows me the image on black and white. So now I just see there's my masked area. There's my masked area, or here or here. It's a little hard to see the shadows against black and white because, well, they're pretty dark. You can show the image against black. And I'll tell you what I like this one for. I really like this when I'm doing luminosity masking because it actually helps me see specifically where the areas I'm hitting with that luminance range are. So I sometimes like to switch to that, show me my color image against a black background. There's also, we can show you the image against white. So we can see just the masked areas against a white background. I rarely, if ever, probably not at all, use this mode. And then finally, we have one that's white on black. Now, this is going to show the masked areas of your image as a white or gray tone against a black background. Let's look at the greens, for example. This should look familiar to anybody who has worked with a layer mask in Photoshop. Any of the areas that are white will be the areas that are affected. White reveals and black conceals. We know that from Photoshop. It's the same thing here. Anything you see in white is part of the mask. Anything that's black isn't part of that mask. And the shades of gray in between are semi-transparent parts of the mask. Typically, I find myself using only 3 modes. I'm either using the traditional color overlay and whatever color is easiest to see against my background, red or green usually. I'll use that white on black mode, which is, as I said, looks very much like when you're working with a layer mask in Photoshop. That just makes sense to me. I'm used to knowing that everything that's white in this scene now is the stuff that's going to be affected by my sky mask there. And then, as I mentioned, I do like that show me the image on black against black, because it helps me see tonal ranges if I'm using luminosity masking or luminance masking. I'll show you all of this in a minute. Your mileage may vary, of course. Choose the ones that make sense to your brain, the way that you want to look at your masks. I suspect a lot of you will start with the color overlay because it's familiar, but try some of the other ones. There's another little submenu in here for showing the pins and tools, the little pins that light up each of those things, and the individual controls for the gradient and brush and radial gradient. I have mine set to auto, so they show up when I'm working with the tools, but they hide when I pull my cursor out of the screen. There is an option to show or hide any of the pins that aren't active. And then here's where I could change those color overlay settings. So within the panel that holds the main sliders for making the local adjustments over here, you will find that there are 2 helpful new checkboxes. One of them will invert whatever the currently selected masking component is. So if I wanted the rest of the picture instead of the sky, I could just check the invert box, and now it's everything except the sky. It's the subjects in the foreground. You can also get to that invert business by selecting your layer component, your masking component, and going into this little 3 dots menu here and telling it you'd like to invert it. You can also, let me open that up. I need to go to the sky part of it. And right in here, it'll let me invert that component. I find it much easier to go to this little checkbox right here personally. So whenever I've got something and I'm trying to get, well, the opposite of it, like let's start with this picture. So very quickly, I'm going to select subject here. We'll get these folks in the foreground. We've got them. Turn off the overlay so that I can see what I'm doing to them. And let's say we bring down the highlights just a little bit of a hot shine on them. I can double click again. I'll call it subject. And then I can make another mask, another select subject. And here's where I'm going to go click that invert button right here, this little guy right here. Yeah, I could get in there and do it. It's a lot harder, I think. So I'm just going to click it right here. And now I'm masking the background. And for the background, maybe we'll warm up that sunset a little bit. If we want, we could make it a little brighter or a little darker. I'm going to darken it down a little bit. So you can see how easy it is for me to very quickly break apart my foreground and background in a shot. Couple of more basic demos, because I want to make sure you guys understand how the fundamental building blocks of these masking tools work before we start combining them in all sorts of clever ways. So I don't know how many of you have played with the luminosity masks before. These are things, or luminance mask, I guess those are interchangeable. These are masks that will select part of your picture based on how bright or how dark it is. So I've already gone and made a selection here using a luminance range. And what I want to draw your attention to over here is these controls for the luminance range. So what you have in here, this box in the middle is the selected range. This is the range of colors that's actually going to be part of the mask. And it ends at the edges of this box. And then you see these 2 pins over here, and these let you control the fall off. So instead of it abruptly cutting off the selection at the dark side and the light side of this box that you've defined, that's the whole range of brightnesses you're about to select and mask off, we can make it so they sort of fade off a little bit and have a more gradual fade away instead of a hard cut. In fact, I'm going to check this little box to show you the map in here. And you can see that, yes, I'm selecting this main range of color here, but there's also a little bit of it that's getting down into the darker and a little bit of it that's getting up into the brighter range. That's the luminance range. So I am covering a range from about 53 to 78. So 53 is the lower end here, and 78, we've got the numbers here. And then I'm letting it fade out all the way up to 99, the real bright colors, and I'm letting it fade down to about 32. So I can narrow those little sliders and it'll only hit a smaller range, or I can expand them and it'll taper off a little bit better. Get back to that setting here. So I'd like to do a little demonstration that'll help you guys understand how this luminance range business works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch my overlay. Instead of being red like this, which, yes, it shows us the range that we've selected, I'm going to switch to that one that I mentioned where I've got the image on black. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the slider here. Now we can see exactly which zone of color. So if you look at this picture, it has all of these different ranges of brightness or luminance to them. And I'd love to be able to target, say, this range in the middle here. Maybe I want to add a little more clarity or some dehaze or something to work with it. Maybe I want to do something that just affects the trees at the bottom. So let me turn that overlay on. And as I slide this back and forth, you will see the range moves. So down here, I'm going to get the really dark stuff in the foreground because that's at the dark end of the spectrum over here, right? And if I move it to the right, it's going to start grabbing all the brighter stuff up top. So what's in the black here is not part of the mask, and what you see lit up in color is part of my mask there. So what I've done is I've created a luminance mask that is affecting just the central part of this image. Everything that's in the black isn't going to be touched. I'm going to turn that overlay off. So now that I have that sort of magic little area, we can put the overlay back to color, make it a little easier to see again. I can now take that area that I have masked off by luminance, and maybe I'll add some clarity to it like that. Could go the opposite direction and sort of soften that and make it more foggy and misty. Same with dehaze or contrast or any of the other adjustments. I can selectively make just that area darker or brighter. So I love these luminance masks. They allow me to grab up a particular part of my image. So for example, actually, I think I have an even better example than that. Yeah, here's a good one right here. Famous black sand beach in Iceland. And I like this picture. There's one thing I want to change about it. The surf down here is just the tiniest bit too hot. So I can open up my masking here. I can create a luminance range mask. And in fact, you can go right into your picture and just use the eyedropper to pick a range. And when I do that, I've gotten my surf, but I've also gotten a lot of the sky as well. So I can come in here and I can limit this to the very brightest part of the surf by using these controls here. I've lost a little bit of the sky. So right now, if I lower the highlights just a little bit, I can bring back the tone that's right here in my picture that was just a little bit too bright. And it sure would be nice if we had an easy way to get rid of the sky as well. I think I've already gone and masked this for you. And what I've done is I have done a luminance range where I've gone ahead and selected the brightest parts of this picture so that I could darken down that bright surf a little bit. But I then went in and I subtracted the sky from it, because you can add and subtract these little components. So I said, hey, Lightroom, go find the sky and subtract it from this luminance range that I have that's picking up the sky and a little bit of the beach. I just want the surf. And when I subtracted the sky out, I ended up with a mask that just hits the surf. We switch this to the white on black so you can really see it. And there you go. That's a beautiful mask that I did not have to go in and hand paint. that Lightroom was able to get in there and find for me. A few more basic examples, and then we'll get a little more complicated. And I'll show you how to do some of this addition and subtraction business. We obviously have a color range tool. We had it before, but it was buried inside some of the other tools, and you had to do some funny tricks like putting a linear gradient off the side of the picture. Well, now I've got my own full color range tool, so I can click the color range tool to bring it up. I've got a new mask that it's about to create based on color range. And if I come into my picture, there's two ways you can tell it what range of colors you want it to pick for that mask. One is simply to click. And in this case, if I hover over it, you'll see it's done a pretty good job of just selecting all the red paint in this door. You can also hold the Shift key down and add up to 4 more points. You'll see little eyedroppers. So if you happen to have some sort of in-between shades, the other thing that you can do with this tool is you can click and drag, and it'll take a whole range of tones. That actually got me a little bit better. So now that I've selected with my color range mask everything that's red on this door, let's say I just want to change the color a little bit. You can make it a purple door or a blue door. And for the most part, my masking seems to have grabbed all the colors I want. There's a little bit of an area up here it didn't seem to get. So I'm going to hold the Shift key and I'm going to add one more little color. And I think that's going to get me all the reds that were there. And of course, I don't have to just change the hue. We could make it a much darker shade of blue by changing the exposure. We could play with the saturation if I want to fade it out a little bit. You can see up here just a little bit more red. And if I shift click on that, I should be able to add it. When you get beyond 5 points, it'll tell you, and it'll say, color range is limited to 5 samples. You can Option or Alt click to remove one. But at this point, I've gotten a good color range mask for this particular one. You can always temporarily turn off your masks using the little switch here. It's just like all the other little switches in Develop. So if I click that, my masks are temporarily off and I can see my original, I can turn them back on. And you can also turn off individual masking components by clicking their little eyeballs there. All right, let's reset that one. One more quick color range example for you. If I want to change the background of this Coke machine to something other than Coca-Cola Red, I'm going to use the color range, and I'm going to select a range of colors with my little click and drag with the eyedropper. And let's just see if I turn that black and white. Yeah, I got most of them. There's a tiny little color there. I'm going to add that. And now I think we've got just about everything in here that's some shade of red. And as I said, all of the sliders that are over here can be then applied to just the red parts. Remember, in this view, the white parts are what are being affected. Let me go with color overlay on black and white, and that's not going to help because it's black and white. We'll go color overlay, and I'm going to switch my overlay to green. Hopefully that'll make it. There we go. Now you can see exactly where the mask has been selected. And now I'm free to, change the color. We'll make Coca-Cola purple. We'll make it brighter or magenta. So we have all of these little components. We can mask our pictures by color. We can mask our pictures by brightness. We can mask them by subject. We can mask them in all sorts of really clever ways. But where it really gets interesting is where we can start to combine these things together. So I'd like to give you a couple of examples of how we can do some additive, subtractive, and intersecting masks. This allows us to build up a much more complex mask than we might otherwise be able to do. So let's go back to the beach in Iceland. Let me open up the masks. I've already got one here for the white surf, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this sky mask here, the one that I had subtracted from it. I'm just going to delete that. So right now, if I turn my overlay on, you'll see that my white surf mask group here has the only component it has in it is something that is selecting this rather bright range of surf, but it's also picking up some of the sky. So all I have to do to remove the sky from this mask is to come over here to this button that says subtract. And when I click subtract, I can subtract using any of the 8 tools. And in this case, I'm going to say, just take the sky out of my selection. And boom, the sky's gone. And the only selection I have now is affecting the surf here. You can see where I've taken what was a too bright of a white cap, and I've been able to knock it back a little bit and control how bright that was. So what we did there is we subtracted something from it. Let's do a few more of those. Or we'll do an additive one, actually. This will be fun. So let's take this picture of my friend Jonathan. I think we can all see what's wrong with the exposure right away. It's very bright in the background. He's a little bit washed out because he's backlit. So let's mask this thing. I'm going to start by selecting my subject. All right, let's name that mask Jonathan. And I would like to make another selection of the subject, but I want to invert this one so it's everything except Jonathan. So I'm going to click that invert button right there. Right, so now I have a mask that's getting everything except him. So we'll call this background or water or whatever you want to call it, background water. So I'm going to start with the mask I made of Jonathan, and I'm just going to give him a little bit of clarity, a little bit of contrast, and I'm going to maybe bring him out of the shadow, bring the exposure up a little bit or the shadows. There we go. So he's looking a little bit better. I can see him a little bit better against the background. Now let's work on that background. So right now, if I darken down the background, it's going to also get this bit in the foreground where he's standing. I'm okay with the exposure there, but I'd love to darken down the lake. So I'm going to take this background water business and I'm going to click on it to activate it. And I'm going to click the subtract button and I'm going to subtract from it, in this case, with the linear gradient. So I'm going to start right here and I'm just going to fade that out a little bit and position it. Maybe I'll make it a little bit wider. And what I've done is I've subtracted that gradient out from the background. So now the only thing that's being affected there is the water itself. Let's position that a little closer to the water's edge. And now when I pull the exposure down in the background to balance this frame out, it's not getting the foreground because I deliberately told it to subtract out this bit using the linear gradient. So this is the beginning of how we combine these different tools together. I can add pieces together. I can subtract pieces from each other. I can intersect pieces with each other, and they allow us to make these sort of clever kinds of selections. Let's do a couple more additive and subtractive kinds of deals here. Got some more demos for you. Here's a good one. I'm real happy with the foreground exposure here. My figure looks pretty much the way that I'd like to. Maybe I'll select subject here and darken down just a little bit of the bright highlights that are here. Tone that down a little bit. We'll name that Sandy because that's who it is. But what I really want to do is I want to fix the background in this picture. So I could do it a couple of ways. I could actually just make another mask. This is probably the easiest way, and then just invert it. That'll let me get to the background and I can turn up the saturation or turn down the exposure and get that wall looking a little bit more the way that it did in real life. So I want to explain how the intersect works too. Adding and subtracting make a lot of sense, right? I can come in here and let's say I make a radial gradient here. And I'm going to make this a really extreme adjustment so it's really easy to see. Make it very hard edged. All right, so I've darkened this area considerably where this radial gradient is. And if I want, I can add another piece to this. I could add a color range, or I could add a brush, and I could just sort of, paint more around the edges or over here, anywhere I'd like. They're all part of this mask. I can add a linear gradient. And that also becomes part of this mask. I can subtract things from it. I can click the subtract button and I can grab a brush and I can say, I don't want the middle of this mask to show up. So adding and subtracting make a lot of sense. They're pretty simple. Let's delete all the masks. I'm just going to right click on the mask list and delete them all. I want to show you intersect. You might remember intersections from Venn diagrams in your math class. So let's put a radial gradient here. And I've got one adjustment here. Oh, by the way, there's a new little checkbox at the bottom of the panel here to reset the sliders automatically after each use. I kind of like that. So I've been leaving it on so I don't have to go back and sort of clean them up each time. Okay, so I created this circle right here and I made it very, very dark, -4 stops of exposure. And now what I'd like to do is I would like to intersect this with another radial gradient. So instead of the add or subtract button, you have to hold the Option key down on a Mac or the Alt key on a Windows, and those add and subtract become intersect. Show me the overlapping intersection between these things. And in this case, see if I can get my, there we go, get my cursor back. I want to intersect it with another radial gradient. And I'm going to draw this one over here temporarily. And we're going to make that one also a low exposure. So I've got this one and I've got this one. And if I bring them to where they overlap, this is my mask, the intersecting area between them. I have this mask over here that was my first one. And then I said, hey, take that initial mask I drew out and intersect it with another circle. That's this one. And the resulting mask is that. The intersection of these two circles, the overlapping area in your Venn diagram from high school. And you're thinking, okay, yeah, that's great for Venn diagrams. How is this useful again? How does this intersection help me? Well, I've got some great examples to show you. So let's take this model right here. I think we figured out so far, it's pretty easy to select the subject. I'm going to click to open up my masking tools. I'm going to select the subject, and I have a mask that's just her. But now I'd like to get the dress. In other pictures, I might have been able to just do it with a color mask, and I could probably do it here. But for the sake of this demo, what I'd like to do is I'd like to do the intersection of the subject and a color range. So I'll take my subject, which I will name once again by double clicking on it. I'm going to hold the Option or Alt key right here in my pane, and I'm going to do intersect, and I'm going to say, do me a favor, intersect the subject. That is sort of, when you're doing one of these intersections, it's sort of like a where plus a what. So where I'm looking is within the subject, and then what I'm looking for now is a color range. And I'm going to go in there and I'm going to sample this purple dress. And in fact, I'm going to do the click and drag so I get a fairly wide selection of colors. And now I have just the dress. So I selected my subject, I intersected it with a color mask, getting me just the dress. In fact, I'm going to relabel this dress because that's what it really is. And that's a subject intersected with a color range. And you can see here in the color range, if I turn on the overlay, I missed a few spots up here, there. And just by shift clicking and adding one more of those little pins, well, I've now been able to select that dress within the picture. Let's go to white on black for a second because I want to show you something in the overlay. So you can see very clearly here in the overlay that I've gotten the whole dress, but I've also picked up a tiny little bit in her necklace and her lips. There were some other things in there that were close to the original color range. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract with a brush, and I'm just going to come in here. I'm going to paint those areas out of my mask. Okay, the face and the little necklace, they're no longer part of my mask. O to turn the overlay back off again, and I am free to change that dress to a different color. Let's make it something like green. Forget what it was originally. It was pink originally. Yes, it was pink originally. So I can make it green. I can turn the saturation up or down. I can change the exposure or the contrast. If I think I'm missing part of the color range, I can come back and maybe select another one in there. But that's a pretty quick and dirty way of being able to change clothing for a figure. And I did it through adding, subtracting, and intersecting. So let's do it again. A couple more examples. Let's start with this one. Start with my friend Chelsea here. Back out so we can see all of her. So if I'd like to change the color of her jacket, I'm going to start by selecting the subject. And I've got a mask that's just the subject. I'm using that white on black because I find it easiest to see, but you can switch that to the color overlay, switch it to whatever you like. And then what I'd like to do is I'd like to intersect that with a color range. So I'm going to Option or Alt and click on this little button here that says intersect. And we're going to come down here and I'm going to choose a color range. I'm just going to start with one little eyedropper of color here. I'm going to turn on my overlay to see how I did. Not bad. It did a pretty good job. There's a refine slider over here that lets you narrow or expand the range of colors. So as I turn this down, you'll notice it's narrowing the range of colors to mostly her jacket. I'm going to pick a couple more ranges here, but it's still picking up a little bit of her face that I don't want to be part of this as I am trying to just change the color in the jacket. So what am I going to do? I'm going to subtract from this mask with a brush. So I'll come over here, I'll click subtract, I'll pick up a brush, make my brush a little bit bigger here, and we will remove these white areas that would have been part of our mask with a brush. This is some of the power and the flexibility that we get. So now what I have here is a mask that is really keyed to just the jacket. Let me switch to the color overlay. So you can see it's just here on the jacket. That's it. That's all it's picking up. Maybe I'll add one more color back there. Now we've really got the whole jacket there. Okay, now that I have it masked separately, let's give her a, I don't know, let's give her a purple coat. There you go, a purple coat. I love it. So I'm going to just label this jacket. I might still come back over the top and create another subject mask that just hits Chelsea herself, including the jacket. And maybe I want to bring my highlights down a little bit or add a little bit of clarity to her face, that kind of thing. And while we're at it, so we'll call this one Chelsea. And while we're at it, let's fix that sort of pale background. I'm going to make another mask. I'm going to select the subject again, but I'm going to invert that. Now I have the background and we can, I don't know, darken the background a little bit or maybe put some dehaze in there, add a little contrast. And very quickly, we are able to get from here, where we started, to here, where we made some nice selective changes to the image and did it in a way that I think they all blend together pretty nicely. Pop over to the chat for any questions. How do you cancel the mask or start over again? That's a great question. And I was asked, if you select the subject and there are 2 or 3 people in the image, what happens? Well, I will show you. We'll select some multiple people. The ability to then name the masks, I agree, RJ, it is phenomenal. It just helps me organize things beautifully. So if I want to cancel the existing masks that I have, I'm going to open up the mask tool and I'm going to go into these layers here, any of these masks that I've created, this one or this one or this one for the jacket. And I can right click on it, or I can click the little menu. And there's one right here that'll delete all the masks. Or I can just delete the one that I've called jacket, or I can rename it or hide it. So it's very easy to just delete all the masks and get right back to where you started. And somebody else asked about multiple subjects, multiple people. I'm almost certain I've got some examples in here. Yeah, okay, let's try this one. This has a whole bunch of subjects in it. Beautiful Liszt Alfonso dancers in Havana. I'm going to click my masking tool. I'm going to click that magic select subject button. And what's it going to do for me? Boom. Got them all pretty much. And let's say I just wanted to lighten up the bottom parts of this, lighten up the bottom parts that are kind of dark there. I could intersect this with a linear gradient. It just sort of fades out when it gets to here. And now my mask is just hitting down there. So that allows me to selectively bring up the shadows just down there without affecting any of the other parts of the image. And that's what these masking tools do, is they really let us refine things. Now let's go do another group one. So here's a perfect example of how we've gotten from cruder to more sophisticated tools. The first time I processed this image, I had to go in and sort of hand paint the mask that I wanted. What I really wanted to do was to dial down the Teletubby selfie in the background in favor of my lovely subjects in the foreground. And I did an okay job getting in there with the paintbrush and trying to sort of mask it off, but it's a piece of cake now. I'm going to select my masking tool. I'm going to tell it to select the subject. And I've got them right there, the twins. In fact, we'll double click, we'll name them twins. I'm going to make another mask. And by the way, you can duplicate a mask. If I right click on it, I could duplicate this mask. And then I could call this one background, and I could invert it. And I now have a mask for the background. Super. But you'll notice that when I inverted it, I got there, you could see that there was a little bit that the mask had missed in the foreground. So I'm going to delete that background mask. Let's go back to the foreground. I'm going to hit O to turn on that overlay. Right here, my select subject didn't quite make the grade. Did a pretty good job on the rest of it. For some reason, it left this off. So how can I include this in my mask? Well, I can go in there and I can take my twins mask and I can add to it a brush, and I can just paint with the brush right there. And now it's part of the mask that includes them. Did a nice job on the thin hairs here at the edges. And now I'll select a new mask. I'll select the subject again, but I'll invert that. And because it's included this again, in this case, I'm going to take that background mask, we will call background, right? I'm going to click on it. We can see here's the subject mask that then got inverted to grab me the background. And I can subtract from that with a brush, and I can get rid of the little bit that it was catching. All right, O to turn off the overlay. Now let's take that background and let's dial back Mr. Teletubby a little bit. I can see my foreground figures so much better now. And let's go to the foreground and let's tune this up a little bit. I want to bring those highlights down. I might want to warm the color temperature just a little bit in their faces. I like that a little bit better. I might even add a little bit of clarity. So we've created a slightly more complex mask. Now what I'd like to do with my subject mask here in the foreground is I'd like to be able to change the color of everything that's red on their shirts, except for their lipstick. So I'm going to make one more mask, select subject. We're going to call this one before I do anything. I'm going to call this one shirt, or shirts in this case, plural. And I'm going to do the same thing that I did before, which is I'm going to add with a brush that little piece here. I could have actually just duplicated my existing mask. That would have worked too. All right, so now that I've got this, what I'd like to do is I'd like to get the parts within this subject selection that are just the red. So what am I going to do? I'm going to use the intersect option. I'm not adding or subtracting. I'm saying, okay, within the subject that I've selected here, subtract for me, or intersect for me, excuse me, the stuff that is within this color range. So I'm going to go color range. Let me turn the overlay off. And I'm going to come down here and I'm going to pick some red from here. Now let me turn that mask back on, and you will notice that now the only things that are in this particular mask, there's a little bit in the face there, are the things that were red. I'm going to switch our overlay to white on black so you can see it a little more clearly. Once again, I have this refine slider over here. As I move it to the right, I'm going to pick up more shades of red, and that includes skin tone. As I move it to the left, I'm going to pick up fewer. But even when I dial this down, I'm still picking up that red lipstick because it's the same color as the flowers on the shirts. What am I going to do? I'm going to subtract those out with a brush. I'm going to subtract, pick up the brush, and I'm just going to remove those areas from this particular color range mask. Now, when I turn this off, we can change the color from red to say magenta, Maybe I want to darken it a little bit or dial back the saturation a little bit. Notice their lips did not change colors. The lips stayed red because after I selected my, let's see if I can find this little, here's the person, here's the subject right there. You can see there's a little person mask, right? And then here's the color range that got intersected with that mask. And yes, while I'm hovering over it, you do see the other areas. And then here's the brush area where I went and brushed out their lips so they wouldn't be in the final mask. All three of these combined together to make the final shirts mask. So you can see how I've got this mask grouping, and then within it is a subject component, a brush component, a color range component, another brush component. And next to each of those, you'll see little pluses and minuses as you add them, indicating whether they were added, subtracted, or intersected. Intersection will show up as a minus and an inverted mask because, well, technically, that's what it really is. Couple of more examples, and then I think maybe I'll stop and take some questions. Oh, here's a brilliant one. I love this one. Here's a great combination of the two tools. So let's say I pick up an adjustment brush here, new mask, I grab the brush, and I want to come in here and I want to do some painting to these trees. Maybe I want to drop the shadows a little bit to make them a little more contrasty, or turn up the clarity, or add a little texture. I don't know. And I come in here with my brush. Let's make it more severe than that. Let me darken it so it's really obvious what I'm doing. And I come in here with my brush and I paint. And if I'm a little sloppy and I get up into the sky, oh, that's kind of messy, isn't it? Right? Oh yeah, I was able to paint all this area down, but now I've got all this stuff that's leaking up into my sky, which is a problem unless I can go in and click the subtract button and tell it to subtract the sky out from this. And boom, there goes my edge. It's all cleaned up now. And I have this, well, kind of odd mask. You can see the areas that I painted, but there's the sky mask, and there's where I had brushed, and there's the edges of the brush being cleaned up by subtracting out the sky from it. So let's see, we go back to the brush and, fill that in a little heavier. So it's a little more obvious. Now I can color outside the lines all I want. It's still subtracting the sky from this adjustment brush. No matter where I paint it, it's going to keep subtracting out the sky. I think that is just brilliant. I am just like knocked out by that. While we're on this picture, let me use another example that I've got here. I'm going to delete all those masks. I'll bring up another one that I created. So I wanted to fix the sky, but I also wanted to fix the reflection down below, because there's no real easy way for me to select the reflection. At least it didn't seem like it at first. So here's what I did. Let's go ahead and reset all of these. Delete all masks. You can see the sky's a little pale. The blue's kind of flat, and I'd love to just give it a little more love. I'm going to select the sky with a mask, which I will name sky. And then I'm just going to overlay a little bit of blue here. That's actually all I really wanted to do this. I suppose I could give it a little more clarity or something if I want to bring a little bit more detail in there. And then what I can do to get the area down below, there's a couple of ways that I could go at this. Let's try, I'm going to select the sky again. I have a new mask. I'm going to invert it, right? So now I've got everything except the sky, everything below there. Let's make this red so you can see it a little easier, or green. So there's everything except the sky. Well, what I'd like to do is I would like to limit it to just the blue areas. So what I'll do with this reflection, which we'll name, is I will intersect it with a color range. And I'll say, okay, I just want the blues down here. I'll add a couple more. And it's picking up a little bit too much up here. So I might subtract with either the brush or the linear gradient. And we will just subtract all of this business here. And it's no longer in my mask. And now my mask is just hitting the reflection down in the water. Perfect. That's what I want to do. I'll do the same thing. I'll add that little blue chip to it. And in this case, I might dial back the saturation, or I might brighten it up just a little bit. Maybe I'll turn down the dehaze, make it a little softer. And I've got a better match of my reflection for the sky. Popping over to the chat to see some questions. Is select subject just for people? No, it's not. Can you mask only one person in a group of people? It's a little harder if it doesn't find the individual person, but I'll give you one little trick when it comes to using that select subject. If it doesn't grab the subject that you want right away, you can actually go in and change the exposure to make your subject pop off the page a little more, and then make the select subject, and it'll get a better outline for it. And then you can go back and reset the exposure to whatever you want. You've got your mask. The answer is yes, I can tell it to select subject here, and I can have it get one of these cars. Let's see how it does. Picked up a little bit of the neighboring car. Let's try another one. How about this one? Found this one somewhere in Prague, I think. Let's select subject. Let's see how well these genius little routines can work. And yeah, they made me a darn near perfect mask of that car. Beautiful. Now, if I want, I could do something like invert that and darken down the background so we can really see the car pop forward. Starting to get a feel for how these things can be intersected with each other, added and subtracted and multiplied. Let's take a picture like this one, where I'd love to be able to swap the color of this great Pete Wallinger graffiti. Pete's one of our local artists here in town. You've probably seen his stuff all over town. And in this case, obviously, I'm going to work with a color range mask. So let's start with a color range. And I'm going to pick this nice swatch of orange right here. How'd we do? A little hard to see with a red on orange. I'll switch to white on black. Now, how'd we do? Not bad, not bad at all. I might like to add that darker orange and that lighter orange that's there to get a whole range of it. So now I have a pretty good mask here, but you'll also see that there's some white in my figure. So if I change the color of this to something like, oh, I don't know, bright magenta, it's getting into his skin. If I zoom in there, see if I can do a box zoom on him. If I zoom in there, we're getting some of that purple is actually getting onto his arm here. We don't want that. So what can I do? Well, I can subtract out the subject from my mask. Let's pick up that mask. Let's subtract the subject, and assuming it can find him there. And the funny thing is in this case, it doesn't work very well. It found the big eyeball and him. So it didn't work very well for me in that case. In that case, I might need to go in and do a little bit of work inside there, or I could try the trick that I mentioned a minute ago. Let's delete all our masks here. And I could try to brighten up the exposure here enough to the point where I might be able to select the subject a little better. Did we get him? I don't think we did. It's up here. So in the case of this image, select subject did not work very well. And I deliberately included this because I wanted you guys to see that sometimes it does not do the job. It does not make the cut at all. Oops. But the idea of being able to add and subtract the ranges, yeah, that's super helpful to us. Let's take the man in the red hat. I'll show you another addition subtraction trick. Same problem I had with some of those other pictures, right? The background is all washed out, and I can use an inverted select subject to get the background, can't I? But it's going to be missing this little gap between the ribbon and the hat because that just doesn't get picked up. So if I select the subject, all right, we've got him. There's the man in the red hat. But you'll notice there's no knockout there for where that should show through. Let's invert this so we can work on the background. Click invert. Let's darken that background down quite a bit. Maybe a little dehaze. Now it looks a little more natural to scene and doesn't look so sort of washed out, except right here. Right here where this tiny little area isn't included. So I would like to, in this case, add to the background mask, and I'm going to add a brush. And you guys might remember that we had the ability to turn on an auto mask in our brush, make sure it paints inside the lines. So now with the auto mask turned on, I can just come in here, and as long as I keep my crosshairs inside that area, there we go. We can knock out that little area and our mask reflects as much. I might also soften the edge of that brush a little bit more. But there we go. I was able to select the background and then do an additive selection to it to get just that. Pop back into chat. I'm sure there are more questions coming in as we get to this. What if it's a more subtle subject like one of several mushrooms? You may end up having to go in and paint that selection. How would I select only one of the twins? So I would start by selecting them both. We still have them masked the way they were. And let's go ahead and reset these masks. I'll delete them all. These are all great questions, by the way. You guys are getting right into the specific use cases I was hoping you'd find. So we're going to select the subject. I've got them there. In this case, I'm going to use one of our colored overlays. I'll switch it to green. I'm going to turn that overlay on. And then what I would probably end up doing in a case like this is I would end up subtracting with a brush. We would take out twin number 2 over here on the right. And as I get closer to the other one, it helps that I have a large feather in my brush here. So it makes that edge where it meets the other twin soft and not obvious, where I've sort of cut it out. Oh, and auto mask is still turned on, so it's doing a terrible job of removing all of that. Let's turn auto mask off. Anybody remember the keyboard shortcut for auto mask? It's actually a sensible one. It's A for auto mask. So there, now I have subtracted from the mask the girl on the right. We'll just call this left twin. O to turn the overlay off, and now I can separately adjust her independently of her sister on the right. Excellent question. Let's do a couple of more where we might have to brush something in or out. You guys might remember this one from some of our other Photoshop workshops or Lightroom workshops, where I have wanted to change this car to another color. And in the past, I had to make these complex range selections and do other things. Now I can basically come in here. Let's delete that mask. I can tell it I want a color range. I can drag out a fairly wide range here of greens. And in this case, let us shift our overlay color to red. You can see that it's grabbed the entire car. I've got the entire car, but it's also picked up the yellow that's down here on the stripe and the green that's back here on the grass. So if I do turn the car a different color, like magenta or blue or purple, it's also turning this area down here a color, and it's coloring up the grass. And in this case, I will subtract from the mask with the brush. Take a big soft brush, and I will just erase out, and I get my grass back, right? Get my grass back, come down here, I'll get my little yellow parking stripe back. And it looks like there was an area down here in my color range that didn't get picked up, a really dark green there. I'm going to go back to the color range. I'll shift click and I'll eyedropper. Now that picked up too much. So that's too heavy a range. That got all the tones that are in the image basically at that point. Fortunately, I was able to mask the rest of those out. So what I might do is I might move the refinement slider down. Notice as I move it down, I'm narrowing the range of pinks that it's picking up. And as I move it up, I'm picking up a greater range. So in this case, I'm going to move this slider up to pick up some of those other, what was originally green that I had selected with the color range mask. So on a lot of these cases, I'm using one tool to make an initial selection and then a second tool to kind of refine it. Let's take this another step further. This is a really cool example of how these things all come together. So I love this, this costume figure we found at Carnivale last year in 2020, but the background's a little, it's okay. I'd like to do something interesting with it. So what I did with this image, it's really quite a bit of fun, is I relit the background. So the first thing that I did is I made a mask of the subject and I inverted it so it would grab the background. And I took that background, which is an inverted subject, right? And I just lowered it by like a stop and a third. That's what you see over here that I did to the background. But I also added to it. So this is what that one adjustment looks like. I just darkened down the background, but I didn't want it to look like that. What I really wanted to do was relight the scene in the background a little bit. I didn't want to light her any differently. I like the light that's falling on her, but I'd love to have a little bit of, I don't know, a little warm light coming in from the upper left. So what I did to make this mask here, this is a really fun one. First, I selected the subject, inverted it so I get the background, and then I intersected it with a radial gradient. Let me switch this into the white on black. So what I did is I said, okay, within the background, but not the foreground, I would like to put a radial gradient. In this case, I stretched it out really long and thin. And what did I add to it? I made it about 2/3 of a stop brighter, and I warmed the color temperature up. So here's the wild thing about this light. This is going to blow you away. Let's see if I can make this happen. Come here, you. That's not showing that. Get into the light, get into the radial gradient. When I move this light around, it's behind her. Let's see, there's got to be a way for me to show this. Oh, I know how to do this. We'll turn the overlay on. Here we go. So watch this. Because I am subtracting the subject or the background from this radial filter, I can place this wherever I want, and you'll notice that it's behind her the whole time. So in this case, I chose to sort of place it up here so that what I got was this sort of warming light in the background there. And that had the impact of just sort of relighting that scene back there. So I could very quickly go from something like this to this with just a couple of auto masked selections and a radial gradient. My wedding photographers out there, Pam and Nancy and all the rest of you folks, you guys can use these to great effect, because you know as well as I do that there's some times when you get the shot of the bride and the only environment you have, it's okay. You know, you like had 2 seconds in between the ceremony and the reception, and you just wanted a couple of quick shots, and you'd love to do something more dramatic than this just sort of flat lit scene. And using just the masking tools, I'm able to go from here to here and to get something that's much more dramatically lit that really makes her pop out. In fact, this one combines the old prior masking tools with the new ones. So the first thing I did was to create a shaft of light in the middle of that would shine on her and darken down everything else. That's what I did, is I actually darkened down the outside. And then I brightened her face up a little bit. And then I went in and selected the bride by herself, and we made her a little more contrasty. We lowered the blacks, raised the whites and shadows, dropped the clarity, turned the saturation up a little bit. And then I made one more selection of the background, and I darkened that down by 2/3 of a stop, and I softened it a little bit with clarity. And when I combine all of these little localized adjustments together, and remember, I never had to go in and paint a mask by hand of the subject, I've got this much better relit scene. More examples. Oh, I love this example. This one is so cool. So I shot this bridge down in close to Eureka Springs in Arkansas. And the two things that I would love to do to this picture to get it look closer to what I saw that day is I'd like to get a little more color and saturation out of the sky. And I'd like to tone down the brightest colors that are here on the bridge. Because the sun was at a low angle, it was washing out some of this detail. So let's start with a sky mask. Actually, I already got them here. Let's turn the masks back on. So here's our sky. I did a select sky and it masked it off beautifully. And then on the bridge, in fact, I'm just going to disable this and we'll make a new one. So on the bridge, what I'm going to do to get these bright areas down is I'm going to create a new mask that's based on a luminance range. And I'm going to use the eyedropper to grab this bright area right here. Now you'll notice it did a nice job of grabbing the bright area under the bridge. It got the reflection down here. It got the bright stanchion back here. It got the bright stuff up here. But because a bunch of the sky is in that same luminance range, it also picked that up as well. So what am I going to do? I'm going to subtract the sky from this mask. And now what I get is a mask that just gets me the bridge. If I really want to get fancy, I could come in here and I could subtract with, I don't know, a linear gradient. And fade it out at an angle here. And now my mask is really only hitting the stuff under the bridge. Great, now that I've masked that area off, it's pretty easy for me to just bring the highlights down a little bit, or maybe the exposure. I could add a little bit of clarity or contrast to make it pop out a little more. But the idea here is that by combining these tools, I was able to directly target just the bright stuff under the bridge. Here's an example of how we can go from the cruder earlier tools to the more refined one. So here's one that I had previously tried to work on by basically making a mask that was just going to darken down everything around my subject. It's sort of a, a cheap vignette that I've got here. Unfortunately, it's not the smoothest thing in the world, and it's kind of obvious where I've placed that vignette. So instead of that, let's turn that off. I can make a select subject mask, right? That's going to just perfectly outline my figure there. And then I can much more precisely, well, let's invert it. And we'll darken down the background around this young man like that. So it's very easy to make a much cleaner mask out of these things. If you open a previously edited image where you had used the radial and linear and brush tools, they will remain exactly as edited when you open them up in version 11. If you have made a luminosity or color range mask, they will need to be updated for the new version. And yes, we'll talk about a black and white picture too. So somebody asked me to demo a black and white picture. Let's take this one. So maybe I would like to lighten up or darken down. Maybe I'd like to darken down this section on the right, but leave the highlight on the right side of the monk here. So here's what I can do. I can add a linear gradient, a regular old graduated filter. I'm going to set it to dial down. I don't know, we'll go most of a full stop. And I'll fade it in, and you can see, yeah, that's absolutely darkening, but it's also darkening down his sleeve here, which I absolutely don't want. So let's subtract from that linear gradient that looks like that. Let's just subtract the subject from it. And pow, I get that sleeve right back. And now my mask looks like that. How cool is that, right? I started with that graduated filter and I'm like, hey, that's cool, but don't hit my subject. So I subtracted my subject out. Now I can make that as dark as I want, and I still see my figure separated there. So that allowed me to get in there and completely change the right side of the background of the picture, not just the foreground. Pretty cool, right? How are we doing on time? Oh, where does the time go? Let me tell you. A couple of more intersections for you guys. Let's see, I've got some good demos here. So for example, if I just want her jacket here, I'm going to start by selecting the subject. That's going to get me her. If I want just the jacket, I'm going to intersect the intersection of the subject and a color range. I would like to get the jacket. And that's pretty good. I might pick up a couple of more colors here. Let's turn that overlay on. You'll notice that I've managed, by selecting more and more colors of red, I'm also picking up her scarf and her face, because faces have some magenta in them or some red. So if I'd like, I can either remask this a little bit and open up the area that it covers. But what I'm most likely to do is subtract with a brush all those parts of this mask that I do not want to be affected. Right now, she's the invisible man. And at this point, turn the overlay off. When I change colors or saturation or brighten or darken, I'm just getting her jacket. And yeah, you can see right here where I've missed a couple of colors. I'll go back to the color range. I'll hold the shift key down because I want to add. I picked a point there, but I'd also like to add this color right here and right here, maybe even in right there. And now I've really selected the whole jacket. Now I think that a little bit of her hand is also being grabbed there. So I'm going to try and subtract with an auto masked brush to see if I can't just remove and get, a little bit of her natural skin color back in there without coloring outside the lines. So these all combine together to give us some incredibly powerful tools for selections. So what I'd like to do now is stop the share, open up the floor to actual voice questions, not just the chat session. So feel free to unmute yourselves and throw some questions at me about all of this.
Jeff, I am only seeing you in very little. Your screen has gotten really small.
That's probably at your end. Is everybody else seeing a full-size screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, you need to adjust your Zoom window.
Pardon me?
You can adjust your Zoom window so that the shared screen is bigger and all the speakers are smaller. There's a little dividing line between my little chat head and the rest of the shared screen. You can slide that to make it bigger or smaller.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
So you guys starting to get a feel for how these tools work? One of them selects the subject, which can be inverted to get everything except the subject. One of them selects the sky, which can be inverted to get everything except the sky. It's great for landscape photographers. You want to separately edit your foreground and your sky, boom, instant selections. They work beautifully at the edges. We have the ability to use our existing tools, the brush, the radial gradient, and the linear gradient, and we have the ability to mask off our areas by a range of color, a range of brightness, and if you have one of those fancy iPhones, a range of depth.
So Jeff,
Yes, sir.
when you make a mask and
Mhm.
you want to, and then you want to subtract with the brush,
Mhm.
how do you make the brush bigger or smaller with those?
My favorite keyboard shortcuts, the right and left square brackets. The right bracket makes it bigger, the left bracket makes it smaller. You still have the same brush controls you had in the previous version of Lightroom. There's one for size and for feather. There's a flow and a density and an auto mask. And if you hold Option or Alt, the brush becomes an eraser. All of those tools work exactly the same way that they did before. And you can make that brush bigger or smaller using the slider, or you can make it bigger or smaller using the bracket keys. I find that much handier and easier to control because a couple of taps and I make my brush bigger or smaller. And if you want to change the feathering amount on the edge of the brush, how soft the edge on that brush is, hold the shift key down when you use those brackets and it will expand or contract the feathering. There is one really important change that they made to the radial gradient tool that I want to tell you guys about that I failed to mention. They've changed the behavior. They made it so that when you draw out a radial gradient, by default, you're working the inside of the circle. And if you click the invert button, it's the outside. The old version of Lightroom, it was backwards and it confused everybody. You'd lay down a radial gradient, it would affect the outside and everybody's like, what? And then you'd have to hit the invert button to get it to affect the inside. Thankfully, Adobe changed their mind and they swapped this back to what makes more sense to people. One of the questions in chat, are all these tools going to be available in Camera Raw? Yes, ma'am, they already are. Camera Raw 14. So if you're working in Photoshop and Camera Raw, you have the exact same tools that you have in the Develop module in Lightroom. So those same masking, the select subject and sky and add and delete and intersect, it's all there in Camera Raw, just like you'll find it in the Develop module.
Hey, Jeff.
Yes, sir.
That very first select sky example that you had looked to me like it could have used a little bit of refinement, like the left side of it. And I was just wondering if you could do a select sky again, maybe a little slower.
Yeah, sure. I'll do several of them. And what shows up in the mask, sometimes where the mask blends in with the rest of the picture, the mask gets a little semi-transparent because it's going to partially affect it there. So it may be that when we adjusted that sky, that it would look just fine because the edges of the mask were blending in. Share the screen again. Let's go back to Lightroom. So we'll take this one right here. Oh, not you. How about you? This one should be a fairly easy example because we've got hard edges here. I would expect.
Yeah,
that
and
this
I was thinking, Jeff, select sky with trees, that very first one.
Yep. And we'll go back and I'll do that
Okay.
one for you. So here it had no trouble with it, right? But I want you to notice at the bottom of this select sky mask, right at the tips of the mountain range, there's a little bit of whiteness because this mask is blending into the rest of the area. So there's a little bit of transparency there where some of these border regions were going to be affected. But we can take something like this. And in the case of this one, let me turn off my existing mask there. I can go in and I can select the sky. And look at what a beautiful job it did. Semi-transparent in some of the areas, fully transparent in others, and completely opaque in others. So it does a pretty good job with most of these, even at the edges there. And what I did with this one, I've always liked this photo. It was taken in the early morning hours over at the Shaw Nature Reserve, looking towards the caretaker's house down the road there from the Freund Center. But there was this lovely, warm, sunshiny glow over here that didn't quite show up in the finished picture. So what I did is I went in, that's a little strong. Let's dial that back a little bit. Let's take my radial gradient. I'm going to dial back the saturation a little bit. And what I did is I made a mask that was the intersection of the sky and the radial gradient. So it's really hitting just this area here, but it's making sure not to spill over onto the trees in the foreground. And that allowed me to just sort of warm up that little spot in the sky. Let's find another example with some sky.
Yeah.
Yes.
The radial gradient is accessed now through the mask tool.
That is correct. All of the original tools, the ones that you're used to from the old version, they're all found inside here. Here's your brush tool. Here's your linear gradient, and here's your radial gradient, and the shortcuts are the same. If I don't even have this tool active and I hit the K key, the shortcut for the brush, it's going to go right in and start giving me a brush that I can work with. Obviously, that's not the one that I want. And in this case, picture of my friend Sue, the exposure's pretty messed up. I did a little base development, but the background's still too bright, and the foreground isn't quite what I want it to be. Well, I think you know where this is going. I can mask my subject and I can brighten her up, and I can mask my sky and I can darken it down, and I can get a picture that looks like this very quickly. So here's the mask for the subject, and that is brightening the exposure a bit, opening up the shadows, dropping the blacks for a little contrast, a little clarity. And then I did another one that selected the sky, and that is adding some blue color, some dehaze, some clarity, dropping the exposure and turning up the contrast. And that gets me from here to here and does a much better job of balancing out the exposure. And yeah, we can select things other than people. Let's take this vase here in Josie's kitchen. Select subject. I've got them right there. There's the flowers in the little vase. Maybe I'll invert that and do something with the background to really make those flowers pop like that. Or let's make another one that selects the subject. Maybe I'll select my subject in the foreground and just tune down those highlights a bit that were just a little bit too hot. See those yellow leaves were getting a little blown out. So it just gives us a level of control that we've never had before in the program. And to me, it's just remarkable.
Hey, Jeff.
Yes, sir.
On the select sky, does it work well when you've got, say, like a sunrise or a sunset picture and the sun is coming in predominantly from one side of the image, so you get a real warm area along with a fairly blue
Surprisingly well.
Does it? Okay.
Surprisingly well. In a case of an image like this, it has no problem finding this whole sky.
Gotcha.
It can find it here. It can find it here. It'll find it here. Here's a fun one. So let's take this, right? This was shot at the at Piazza Emo on the hill. And I managed to bury the sun right behind the fountain here. But I'd love to warm up that sun a little bit. So let's get in there and let's select the sky first. right? There's my mask for the sky. It even picked up some of the water spray there. But look at that beautiful automatic mask. I did not have to go in there with a tiny little fine brush and paint out in between every one of those little trees. So now what I'd like to do is I'd like to intersect that with a radial gradient. I like to put it right here, let's say. By the way, we have a new handle here. There's a little handle for sliding the feather on that radial gradient. And now my mask is just hitting this little area masked off from the sky in the background. And if I want, I could add a little color to it. Let's make it a little stronger than that. There we go. And now I've just put just a little bit of a sun glow right behind there. It's really subtle, but it isn't bleeding over into any part of my picture. It's not hitting the foreground. It's not doing anything except getting the sky there. Actually, here's an example of how I've masked it off. I made it slightly bigger, and now I've just sort of warmed that up a little bit. So instead of this, I've got that. More questions, keep them coming. These are good. Start to think about which tool you're going to use for a particular problem. Somebody asked about groups. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, if we go back to that lava field picture where you had the foreground, the subject,
Yep.
and the sky.
You got it.
I noticed the subject, there was a little bit of the foreground that came in. Would you take the brush and you just brush that out? Is that the way you?
Yeah, there are a number of ways that I could do that. That's great. And I was actually going to use that as an example. So we've got our subjects here, and you can see that they're leaking a little bit onto the foreground. But to be honest, it doesn't bother me, the area that's spilled over. But you know what I could do? Watch this. So let's just delete all these masks. We'll get rid of them all. Let's start with a select sky. And let's invert that. Now I've got everything except the sky. And then from that, I could subtract the subjects. And that'll get me just the foreground. You'll notice they're still there just a little bit. So this might be a situation. Let me turn my overlay on, or I'll pick up the brush. And like you said, I'll subtract out a little bit of that mask so that I'm really not getting them. I'm just getting the foreground, or in the earlier case that I was just getting the subjects. So let's delete that. If I want to select the subject and it happened to go a little out of bounds right there, well, I'm just going to subtract with a brush, make it a little bit smaller here, and we can remove those rocks that it had grabbed down at the bottom there. And they are no longer part of that. But you can see otherwise it does a nice job of masking out my subjects. And the color range, let me go back to my masking examples here. The color range on the greens was just amazing. It did such a good job. So if I light up my greens, I can make them more saturated. I can change their color. Ugh, that's awful looking. Let's keep it natural. And then like I said, I had also gone in and selected just the shadows. You'll notice here that my shadow mask also picked up my subjects. So what am I going to do? I'm going to go to the shadow mask here, and I'm going to subtract the subject right out of them. And now my subjects aren't part of it. I'm only hitting the shadows that are in that foreground lava field. So now I can decide, do I want to darken that down or really make it contrasty? Do I want to raise those shadows up a little bit? See, the reason you might want to isolate the shadows in an image like this is if I do it globally, everything's going to get their shadows lifted and the image is going to start looking flat. But if I was just trying to shine some light in only the darkest areas, I can use a luminance range that grabs just the dark stuff. You can see right here in my luminance controls, I have the darkest. I'm going from 0 to 1, and then I'm getting a little bit of a fall off up to about 14 brightness there. And that just helps it be smooth. If I don't have those fall off, my little ranges that I mask have kind of hard edges and they don't blend in as nicely. So in this case, I had lifted those shadows up. We could change the color temperature. Maybe you want to have cooler shadows because some scenes that you're in, when you look into the shadow areas, they're cool. I'll give you a good example of that in this one. So in this case, let's select the sky. Let's invert that mask that's getting the sky so it gets the mountains instead. You can see a little bit of red getting into the mountaintops there. That's a good thing. It helps it blend. All right, now I've selected down below here, but let's limit that to the areas that are blue. I love where the warm part of the sunshine is hitting the ridge here, but it's super cool in the shadows. So we will intersect this with a color range, and we'll choose something in the blue range here. Notice how that has left off the warmer parts that the sun is hitting. And now if I want, I can warm up just the blue shadows. Look at that. I'm able to warm up all this stuff that had fallen into the shadow side that had gotten really cool. Let's grab that as well. And that allows me to make really subtle tonal changes. Here's before, where all that stuff in the shadows is very blue. And here's after, where I've allowed a little bit of that warm light to spill over there. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
You have some more questions in
I
chat.
do. I've just hopped over to there. Do the loop deck adjustments work within the masking panes you're using? Yes, they do. I do believe if you have one of the loop deck control surfaces that you can use the knobs the same way you'd use the sliders. Another person, let's see. If it's overdone, it starts looking like a cell phone picture. Absolutely, I believe that it's super easy to overbake your picture using these techniques. If I had taken this shot right here and I had darkened the background too much or lightened the foreground too much, it's just not going to look natural. It's just not. And in fact, I might take the foreground. Let's open up our masking. Let's go grab our subject. I might take the foreground and I might even lower her exposure a tiny bit so she's a better match for the scene. Some of you might recognize this because some of you were standing next to me when I took this picture. But yeah, it's easy to overbake this stuff, particularly with the clean masks we can make. So yeah, I can make her one level and I can make the background. We can really subtract it. Look, if I go too far, that does not look real. That looks like a green screen effect. Same is true if I go too bright on it. But if I pick a nice comfortable spot there, it's certainly a lot better than what we started with that looked like that. We've been able to bring back a lot of that tone. We have a question, how many of these changes are allowed for Camera Club competitions? Well, that's a very good question. There are certain Camera Club competitions where you can't really make localized changes, but it's a little tricky because I could go in there with a highlight or a shadow slider and globally affect my image. But if I went in and I painted a mask and I only locally changed it there, technically that would not be an allowed modification in nature, photo travel, or photojournalism, which are supposed to have a degree of truth to them or accuracy. So those types of adjustments aren't permitted. I will tell you that if you do it well, nobody's going to be able to tell. It's up to you to be honest, of course. Let's see, do I have any more fun examples I want to show you guys? Oh yeah, here's a great example of how I might combine a linear gradient and a color range mask. So here's a real estate interior I shot recently. And you know, if you've ever tried to shoot in the blue hour, that I can white balance for the lighting inside or I can white balance for the lighting outside. In this case, when I got the inside to look right, the whole outside started getting a little sort of bluish or purplish. So what I'm going to do to fix that is I'm going to add a linear gradient that'll just affect, you know, the left side of the picture here. And we'll just sort of fade that out. We know what that looks like, right? It's going to cover that whole area. But then what I'd like to do is I would like to intersect it so it's just grabbing the things in here that are kind of blue. So let's go to that mask. You got to hold the Option or Alt key to turn that add or subtract component into a intersect with a component. Let's intersect with a color range. Let's pick this sort of lavender bit on the patio here. And now I can go in and just warm up that, just that little range outside. I think I need to pick up another little, there we go. That's picking up a little bit more. And now I can warm up just that area. And there's my mask. Let me make it a little more obvious. Go to the white on black like we have in Photoshop. And look at that. Look at that beautiful, complicated mask that went and found all the blue and purple colored stuff over on the left side of the picture beyond the radial gradient or linear gradient, right? So I started with just a thing that was just going to affect that side of the picture. And then I said, hey, intersect that with the color range mask and get me something that'll allow me to warm up that color temperature or cool it down. There it's really obvious how much cooler it is. And there I've warmed it up and we get a picture that goes from blue, bluer outside to warmer outside. It's a better match for my interior lighting. So if you shoot real estate and you've got those exterior, interior lighting, white balance differences, you can use these sorts of tools in combination to solve those problems. One more thing I want to show you in this example. I want to show you why I like that colored image on black when I'm working with luminance ranges. Let's delete that mask. I'm going to create a new one that's a luminance range. And I'm going to narrow that range quite a bit. And again, this luminance range tool, you have this little box in the middle, and this is the range that's being included. Everything outside it is not included, but the little pins let us sort of make that fall off or fade here. And as I slide through this, you can see it's affecting different parts of my picture, but it's a little weird trying to look at it this way. So what I like to do is turn the overlay on and let's switch it to the image on black. And now let's narrow this too. Let's make this a really narrow range. And now as I move this slider, you can see, hey, I'm really only hitting the bright stuff up here. I'll really narrow it down. And as I move the range slider, now I'm catching the highlight stuff on the floor. And the darker I go, the more I'm getting down into the shadows. Like I get all the way down into this dark range. I'll open it up a little bit. And I can see that my changes are going to hit just these colored areas down in the shadows. So I find that's a good tool for seeing exactly where it's going to hit when you're playing with those luminance ranges. The luminance range is a little funky until you play with it. You guys will get the hang of it. More questions? More examples? All right, let's see. Let's look into the whites of their eyes. Have they glazed over on me entirely? No, they're still there. They're still paying attention. Nobody's crying yet, are they? Good. We're not
And
here
what's
to
the review of the radial filter on the fountain?
review of the radial filter on the fountain. You got it. We do take requests. So what I did with that fountain is I started by selecting the sky. Let me switch my overlay to something a little more obvious, like white on black. I started by selecting the sky, and that got me everything. And then I said, that's fine, but I don't want everything that's in the sky. What I'd like is within the sky, I'd like to intersect that with a radial gradient that I will draw out around the middle of this picture. And that's exactly what I did, is I drew out that radial gradient after telling it I wanted to intersect with that first sky selection. And what I ended up with was this, a radial gradient that it takes into account the fact that it is intersecting with the sky. And that's what allowed me to put this warm light behind. Well, let's turn the overlay on here. This allows me to put that behind. Come on, give me that. There we go. See, I can move that around, and it's respecting the sky. It doesn't matter where I put this because it's been told to intersect it with the sky. So I can move it around wherever I like, and I'm moving this sort of spotlight behind my subject. To me, that's genius. I can't believe that they made it that easy to get at the background, which is what I wanted to do here. I just wanted to put a little warming light behind it.
How did you get the two circles there? I don't understand.
So when you draw out a radial gradient, let's just do a basic radial gradient on one of these, because that's a little confusing. This inner circle is the amount of feathering. There's this feather slider. Let me switch to the color overlay, and I'm going to turn that on. If I turn my feathering down, I get a very hard edge at the edge of my circle, don't I? There's no softening between where the effect starts and where it ends. But as I grab this brand new little red dot here, I can increase the amount of feathering and see how it softens the edges.
Yeah.
In fact,
Okay,
I can drag this way in. So yeah, that second circle is representing the feathering.
Okay.
This new little handle at the bottom is a new rotation, which of course in a pure circle isn't going to be obvious. Let's make it into an oval. When I grab this, There's your rotate. And they did something really nice for us. Let me switch to the linear gradient. Let's create a new mask. Let's do a linear gradient up from the bottom. You guys remember how hard it was to change the angle on this? If you were too close to the pin in the middle, it would spin wildly like that. It was really hard to control. And I always told you, oh, go all the way out to the end and steer the biplane this way. Well, they've given us a new tool. There's a little handle here, a little rotate handle, and it works a lot more gracefully. It's just that little white pin. Thank you, Adobe. We needed that desperately. So I can spin that around, because I'll tell you, I have spun that thing around just trying to get it to the right spot.
Yeah.
More questions. You guys are doing great. I love the questions that are coming in, because it tells me you're beginning to get how the individual tools work, how they work in concert. Start looking at the pictures and thinking about what masking tool you might start with and then how you might modify it. Here's another example of a crude one that I'd like to fix. So in the case of this one, I had put a vignette around our model Teresa here, just because I wanted to separate her from the background a little bit. And it's not particularly graceful. Yeah, it kind of darkened the down around her, but it's not really what I want. Of course, instead, let's turn that off. Let's see. Did I already mask this out? Yes, I did. So what I did is I made a selection of the subject and I inverted it, and I used it to darken down the background considerably. So this was my first one, right? This is a much cleaner selection than my crude vignette, right? I was trying to darken down the background before with just sort of this vignette. And you can see where it kind of fades out around her elbow there. It's not nearly as precise. So let's turn that one off and let's turn this one back on. And I did deliberately darken that down considerably. And then I came back and I added a warm light coming in from the left. And how did I do that? Well, I started with a radial gradient. This guy right here that was a circle, really soft feathering. It's got a little color overlay. It's raising the shadows, lowering the highlights, raising the exposure. And I get this sort of warm light that I can cast on it. And then what I did is I subtracted from it the subject so the light wouldn't spill onto her arm here. If I don't do that, see how the light's getting all over her? That's not what I wanted. I really just wanted to light up the back. So I just subtracted the subject from that radial gradient. What you end up with is something that looks like, let's see if we can make this a little easier for you to see, like that. Yeah. These masking tools really make these sophisticated masks possible. They were impossible before. We just couldn't do something like this unless you want to spend all day and all night with a tiny little 1 pixel brush painting the edge. No thanks. I don't have time. I got to get the job to the client in a hurry. I am so happy to have these tools that let me very quickly grab up my subject, my background, my sky, my foreground, and make some nice changes very quickly without having to go crazy with a masking brush.
Jeff, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Norm.
Have you, in terms of selecting a subject, like if you're doing a lot of nature photography, let's say you're a bird photographer and you have, a flock of birds, or you're an underwater photographer like myself, and
Like
you have, a whole school of fish. Well, is the selecting the subject, have you tried that with, like, say, birds? Or
I've tried it with some natural subjects. If there's good figure ground separation, like if you're shooting a bumphead parrotfish against a dark background, it's going to find it no trouble. If you got a bunch of jellyfish, semi-transparent, it might struggle a little bit.
Right.
Watch what it does when I try and select the subject on the black sand beach here. I'm going to go select subject. And what did it get? Well, it picked up the 2 rocks in the background and 3 or 4 of the rocks in the foreground, but it didn't grab these over here.
Right.
So sometimes it struggles a little bit.
Right.
But like I said, I could try to play with the exposure or contrast or other things before I ask it to select my subject, and maybe that helps it do a better job. It can be hit or miss on some of these subjects. Here's what I will tell you. The folks at Adobe are aware of this, and they're aware of the ways we're trying to use this, and they are going to continue to refine this, making better and better selections.
Right.
Let's see, like, let's take a busy subject like this one, where we've got a figure and a bicycle and a bunch of other things.
Yeah, yeah.
What do we think it's going to do with her? I don't know. Let's find out.
Jeez.
Oh, it's not bad. You
Not
know,
bad.
it's partially masked the bike. And of course, if I really wanted to, let's turn that overlay on. I can subtract with a brush, and I could say, yeah, you know, you picked up a little bit too much here in my mask. Could you just get rid of that? I just want the figure. I don't even want this part of the bike. So this is where you're going to get in and combine those other tools. Turn off your auto mask, or you're going to have these little dropouts like I did. Right. And that allows me to very quickly refine that mask to just be what I wanted.
Right. So if you're in Africa and you're shooting animals or photographing animals or birds or whatever, you can use those types of tools to
You sure can. You can at least use them to get a base selection.
base selection. Right?
So here's a group photo. And if I select subject on these guys, let's see how it does. Yeah, it did a pretty darn good. Look at the mask for the hair.
Yeah.
Look at what a beautiful job it does with the semi-transparent, semi-opaque edges of the hair there. Gorgeous. That's exactly what we want. Just the kinds of masks, turn that off, that if I were to invert this here, because it's easier, I've got full control over the background, right?
Wow, nice.
Brighter, darker, more or less saturated. I've actually already adjusted this image a little bit as a test case, but yeah, it absolutely found and masked those people, no problem. In this case, it's now masking the background. Remember, if you're in that white on black, like the layer masks in Photoshop, white is the area that's in the mask and black is the area that's out of bounds. So yes, with complex subjects, it might struggle a little bit to find your subject. It's not perfect, but I will say it's getting better. So in the case of this one, select subject. How's it going to do on her? It's probably going to find her pretty easily. Yep, no problem. And then within her, we could intersect that with, let's say, a color range. Get our coffee cup here. Now I've got a mask that is hitting coffee cup and some of the face. So what I can do here is I can, let's turn that overlay on. I can lower the value of the refine so it's really just hitting the coffee cup. Or I can subtract out the parts I don't want with the brush.
Yeah.
Right? And we now have a mask that just hits the coffee cup. Oh, looks like we missed a spot. Color range. Let me add, shift click to add another spot, another color here. Somewhere in there, let's try getting a range of colors. There we go. I've managed to get most of that mug and change it, you know, green or orange or magenta. There we go. Let's see, any more questions in the chat session. In the beginning, you talked about new search change. Can you show this? Yeah, I think I can. Okay, we're in the grid view. I'm going to hit the backslash key to get the filter bar. Actually, I have to be inside Lightroom first. And we are going to do this by metadata. This is a date one. This one's by month. We'll do this one by day. So let's start by going to every picture I've ever taken. Well, that I have in Lightroom, about 340,000 images here. What I'd like it to do is I'd like it to find every December. There's December. Switch that out on me. I want a month. And I've got December, right? These are all December pictures. I'm then going to narrow it down by day. I'm going to go to December 25th. And there's every picture I've shot on a Christmas going back to 2002. So there's the most recent Christmas photos.
I had a whole bunch of collections created last year. I was doing a photo blog, a daily photo blog for the duration of the year during the pandemic. And I created a whole bunch of collections to just pick up what you're doing here in about 5 seconds. It took me forever to build the collections and then revise them every day.
This is why we love Lightroom, because the
Ah.
computer, the database is so good at selecting. Look, I started with 350,000 images here, 340,000 images, and immediately was able to tell it, show me everything shot on December 25th, regardless of the year. So I can do Thanksgiving, I can do birthdays, I can see every Halloween, every anniversary. That is a lovely new search that they added in here. The photo with the rocks where it didn't include some rocks. How would you include the rocks that it didn't get at first? Well, I would use one of the other additive tools. Let's get back to our selection here. Let's turn off our library filters. Great question. And there's a couple of different ways that I could try and get those other rocks. So let's go in here. Let's go find Reynes Fiara Beach. Click the masking tool. Tell it I'd like to make a mask of the subject. If I feel like it, I'll label it rocks. And right now, my mask is only catching this. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to switch it to an overlay so it's a little easier to see. So there's a couple of things I could do to this rocks one. I could add with a brush. I could add with a radial gradient and then try and sort of limit the range. I could add with a brush and hit a luminance range. Most likely, I'm going to try adding with a brush. I'm going to soften my feather just a little bit, and I can come in here and I can just paint these rocks into my selection. You might have to zoom in. You might have to make your brush a little bit smaller as you get close to the edges, but I can certainly come in here and add these to my mask or my selection. Now, obviously, I want this to be a little more feathered at the bottom here, so it's a little softer. It isn't so obvious where I've been. So I'm going to turn that feathering up a lot. Shift in the bracket changes my feather. Regular bracket changes my brush. And I can get in here and mask these guys into the shot pretty quickly. Okay, so now I've got all the rocks. I could have also tried a luminosity range that skipped the sky. Here's another one. Watch this. If I accidentally get up into the sky here, you know what I can do, right? What am I going to do?
Subtract sky.
You got it. Subtract sky and watch the sky disappear and just clean up that. Oh, there we go. That's a nice clean mask on the edge of the rocks. So yeah, landscape people who don't shoot portraits all the time, these tools are still super useful to you guys. Now, if I hide the mask, I can do whatever I want. Maybe I want to open up the shadows a little bit, for example. There we go. And now we can see a little bit more of those rocks. That's a nice adjustment.
Nice.
Kind of like what that does there.
So you could do that with animals also, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So notice when I turn off the switch for the masks, I get brighter white caps in my surf and darker rocks. And when I turn my masks back on, well, I've got those masks that I used a luminosity range right here to tune down the surf. And then I subtracted from it all the other parts. And then over here on the rocks, I started with a subject selection and added to it a brush selection from which I subtracted out the sky. So the added, subtracted, and intersected parts of these tools, that's the genius part. That's what makes this stuff like magic, is the fact that we can really use it. I mean, if I wanted to, I could select the sky and then limit it to just the blue parts of the sky. So let's say I delete all of these masks and I go do a sky selection. Now let's intersect it with a color range and let's pick a blue here. And yeah, that's it. And look at this. Out of the sky, I just have that range of blue now because I just intersected the sky with a color range. Or I could add to it and say, well, I'd like you to grab this weird dark blue up here. And now my mask is getting a lot more that has the blue. So I might have to do some adding and subtracting to make that work the way I'd want. We have actually gone a little over my planned time for today, but you all seem to be hanging tight with me here. So I want to throw a couple of more ideas at you. The select subject mask and the select sky mask can be saved into a preset.
Ooh.
All you have to do when you apply that preset to another image is update the masks. So I've got a free preset that I'm going to send you guys, or you can download it, or I'll email it to you with your notes, that will automatically make a selection of the subject and make a second selection of the inverted subject, the background. Let me demonstrate that for you, because it is just sort of instant figure ground separation. Let's go into Lightroom. Let's find somebody else to work with. Let's see. We'll take Jonathan here. So in my presets, I have one that I called AI subject and background. So I'm just going to click it, and it's going to make two subject selections, one normal and one inverted. And if I go open up my tools here, you'll see that there's a little warning symbol next to this. And I actually put in the name of those two layers, I put subject, update, and background, update. Right now, the thumbnails are blank. If you look over here and I pick the subject, it says subject 1 needs to be recomputed. So all I have to do is update the mask for this one, and it's got the foreground, update the mask for the other one, it's got the background. I now have boom, boom. So you can build that into a preset. And all I had to do was click on the preset and then update these two masks. It saves you a few clicks of creating the mask and telling it you want to select subject and then making another one and inverting that one. And it does it all for you. All you really have to do is open up the panel and update your two masks, the one for the subject and the one for the background. So I'll send you guys that little preset. You can use it in your own work.
But you can only do those presets with the select sky and select subject?
Oh no, you can add all the other regular tools to your masks, to your presets as well, absolutely. But the difference with these is that if it's one of those AI-based selections, it has to recalculate it. The other thing that's really important that you should know is that if you apply one of these presets to an image that already has some masks in it, they get added, not replaced.
Gotcha.
Okay. And when you copy masks from one picture to another with that, the sync button or copy and paste between pictures,
Right.
you get a choice of adding to the existing masks that are already on that picture or replacing them. So that's really cool. I like the fact that it won't wipe out my masks, and it'll just add new ones to whatever I apply that preset to.
I ask because I use a lot of, or I have been using a lot of radial masks to bring up shadows in the past frequently, because they get, depending on the exposure, they can turn into a black hole.
You're going to find that the luminance range mask,
Right.
and combined with some of the other tools to remove the areas you don't want, that's going to get you right into the shadows. And that's what I love, is I feel like the newest version of the luminance tool basically brings luminosity masking into Lightroom, something I normally had to go to Photoshop for to get a mask that was like just the brightest part of those white caps or just the darkest shadows in those volcanic rocks.
Exactly. I was going to ask you, do you find that these tools are changing your overall processing approach?
They are. They give me a degree of precision that I didn't have before. I've gone back and re-edited a bunch of pictures just to see how these tools work with them, and I'm very pleased with them. Look, I'm not going to go back and re-edit everything in my history, but moving forward, I'm absolutely using these because the kinds of adjustments that I had been trying to make before were a little on the crude or blunt side, and I can now really precisely target these two: subject, sky, or the opposite of those, everything but the subject, everything but the sky. I can target it by color range, by brightness range, by depth range, and then I can use those basic tools of the circular gradient, the linear gradient, and the brush.
Well, I asked
Barb, is your cat picking up all of this?
I asked because I'm starting to think that I will have to go into Photoshop a fair amount less than I have in the past.
I'm not going to say you guys don't need Photoshop anymore, but what I will say is you have far fewer reasons to go over there.
Yeah.
Let me do a quick search through my notes here. So you're going to get a full set of notes. It's going to have keyboard shortcuts. It's going to have some tips. Masks that are applied via a preset don't replace them. They will add to them. No, that actually covered most of what I wanted to talk about. we got through sort of the basic tools, and then we got into those add and subtract and intersect. The first time I played with these, it seemed a little alien. I was like, what's this intersect business? And then I was like, wait a minute, select the sky and then intersect that with just the blue in the sky. Select the person and intersect it with just the brightest parts of their face so that I just tone that down and don't touch anything else. So the more you play with them, the more you try them out with different examples, I think the more they're going to make sense to you. Any remaining questions, folks?
It's amazing.
Well, I think we'll call that a wrap.
Yeah.
I'll get the video to you as soon as possible. It'll get uploaded to a private link on YouTube that'll get sent to you. You guys will get notes, and I will send you the free action that I created that auto selects the foreground and the background for you. And I hope to see you at another one. Hey, if you're not on the mailing list and you found out about this through a friend, I would encourage you to go to jeffhirsch.com and sign up for the mailing list. I promise I won't spam your inbox with a bunch of junk, but you will get announcements and tips and tricks and occasional newsletters I send out. Thank you all for a lovely evening. It was awesome to hang out with so many of you at once, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you, Jeff.
Fantastic.
Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff.
Bye, guys.
See you, Jeff.
Excellent, Jeff. Bye,
Thanks.
everyone.
Thank you, sir.
That
Bye-bye.
was great. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff.